writers, let's talk about synthesis. So your paper is required to use synthesis. And beyond that, synthesis is just a really important way to show that you're using sources effectively as we write these more complex research papers. So to synthesize means to integrate multiple details from multiple sources to create a new, more complex thought. So as we go through this presentation on synthesis, we're going to think about what synthesis means. We're going to look at some examples of what it looks like in a paragraph, especially a research paper paragraph, and how we can use that to make our writing more effective, more mature, and more complex as we deal with complex issues in our college writing. So first of all, you have a textbook reading assignment that mentions synthesis. It might provide some good examples, some good definition, and make sure you have read that before you continue on with this presentation. So synthesis is the same root word, of course, as synthetic. So if you think about synthetic fabrics are man-made. They're made of other fabrics, right? Other things that come together to create something stronger, something less expensive. You could think about a synthesizer, which is a machine that makes its own music, right? You can think about synthetic drugs. So synthetic drugs are created in a laboratory out of other compounds. So the idea of synthesis is in your writing, if you are synthesizing, you are creating something new out of something pre-existing. And that new thing is better and stronger. So you draw on multiple sources and integrate information from multiple places to form new, more complex ideas and understandings. In a research paper, I like to think of synthesis as a conversation between sources that you are facilitating within your paragraphs and within your paper. So you can think of your paper as a book club. You've invited a bunch of sources into this book club. You also are a part of this book club, right? So you don't just sit back and let the sources talk. You are one of the voices in your paper. But as the leader of the book club or the writer of the paper, you are responsible for making sure these sources are interacting well with each other and the conversation is occurring. So at a book club, you would never say, okay, person number one, what did you think of the book? Person number two, what did you think of the book? Instead, you would allow conversation to occur so that you can arrive at more complex understanding of the book. The same is true in your paper. You want to allow conversations to occur within paragraphs with multiple sources invited so that you have a richer view of each of the main ideas in your paragraphs. So synthesis requires you to find similarities and differences between sources. So for example, if you have two sources that talk about the causes of an issue, well, what are the similarities and differences? What are some of the values they have in common? Or what are some of the ways that their opinions diverge? So you need to be able to think about your sources not as separate entities, but as all part of this conversation about the issue that you are also exploring and adding to the conversation. It's then your job to show the reader where sources overlap and diverge, what they have in common and what they disagree about. So you're going to use phrases in your writing that help your readers understand this, such as, on the other hand, source X talks about the causes in this way. And then talk about how those two understandings give us a more complex view of the issue. So you use the sources' varying perspectives to increase your own reader's understanding of the topic. You make the sources work for you and your reader so that your reader has a better understanding of the complexities of the issue because of how these different sources are talking about the issue in different ways. So here's an example. Over on the left, we have a paragraph that has more than one source. So this is a great starting place. In other words, in this paper, I want to see some paragraphs that have more than one source within them. We really want to move away from this sort of basic way of using sources where one paragraph has one quote from one source, the next paragraph has one quote from a different source. That doesn't allow the sources to interact with each other. So one starting place for synthesis is to make sure you have some paragraphs with more than one source within them. In fact, in a complex research paper, most of your paragraphs will have more than one source within them. So we have Franz here, we have Perez here, we have Goldstein here, and they're different studies that all relate to the same topic. However, to really synthesize effectively, you want to talk about the relationship between those sources. Your paragraph won't just be a list of 3 different sources. Your writing makes it clear how those sources relate to each other. So here we have, first of all, a topic sentence. Studies of undergraduate students reveal conflicting conclusions regarding relationships. So that says here we're going to have some conflicting voices here. Franz said this, but Goldstein, on the other hand, so we have this although that makes the relationship between these two clear. And then we have some commentary on the fact that these two sources disagree, suggesting that variables among participant and control group populations must be examined more closely. Here, too, we have a synthesis connector, although Perez expanded on Franz's original study. So this shows how these two sources' ideas are related to each other. So synthesis requires these connectors between the sources that help your readers understand. In other words, you are facilitating the synthesis. You are facilitating the conversation by using these connectors. So that conversation is really important, and here's what it will look like as a paragraph structure, okay? So this is for body paragraphs. Your intro has a sort of a separate structure. Your conclusion has a separate structure, but most of the body paragraphs in the middle will follow this basic structure. We know we begin with a topic sentence, so we're going to use this C, S-E-E here. So C is for statement. That's the topic sentence. You don't begin your paragraph with a source. You begin your paragraph with a statement that you are making that you will then go on to prove using the sources as well as your own logic and reasoning. So we start with a statement. We then provide evidence. This is going to be sources coming in. This is going to be examples coming in. This could be a personal story coming in. So any source or example that supports the claim. And then, of course, explanation on the end of the paragraph or after we pull in any evidence. So even throughout the paragraph, we explain what that evidence means and how that evidence leads us to the conclusion that we're trying to argue for in the paper. Of course, the paragraph will end with a tie back to the thesis. In a synthesis paragraph, we still use C. So we have a statement, we pull in evidence, we explain the evidence, but then we have those synthesis connectors that transition us to a new source. And then we provide evidence and explanation of that source. And sometimes even again, right? So we have another E because we have evidence coming in from another source. Transition to that new source, right? So some of your transitions might look like this. Source A says this. B agrees and writes this. Or B elaborates upon that same idea. It's also a really good idea to include synthesis of different types of evidence. So maybe the first piece of evidence you pull in is a study, like, a scientific study. And then you explain the significance of that study and then maybe link to someone's personal story that demonstrates the same type of thing you talked about in that study. So we have more types of evidence that prove your statement, which makes your statement more acceptable to the reader, right? It's going to be more persuasive. It's going to be more effective as an argument if you have multiple types and sources of evidence to support as many of your claims as possible. So check out this paragraph coming up here. So we have a good example of a synthesis paragraph. We want to see the statement or claim as the topic sentence. Plenty of evidence, so not just one quote from one source, plenty of evidence. Do we introduce each source and connect the sources together well? Do we explain the sources correctly and tie back to the thesis? I also want to note that this paragraph includes really good transitional phrases between sources and explains how the ideas are connected, and the whole paragraph is unified on the same subject. The writer does this by keeping everything on topic, but also repeating key phrases. So we'll take a look at that too in this effective paragraph. So here we go. In red, we have a clear statement or claim. Experts tell us that today's opposition to immigration is expressed in economic terms. We have an example here. For example, Dan Lacey, a workplace consultant, said this. So we pull in a piece of evidence from one source. Here we have a connector in the same economic vein, Thomas Muller. We have a little bit of information about each of these sources. Notice that we have a lot of source context before the quote, which is really strong. Here's what the next person says, right? But we have this synthesis connector. Then we have both of these sources referred to in the wrap-up with these two reasons expressly conveyed, you can see overall, right? In italics, you can see key phrases that help relate to the same point that keep the paragraph unified. Here, I have highlighted each introduction of each source. So you can see the author is mentioned in the signal phrase. We have a little bit of information that increases the sense of credibility we get from the source. And then we lead into the actual quotation. And notice after the quotation, we have some of our own explanation so that it's not just quote, quote, quote. We have an introduction to the quote. That source sandwich is happening really well here. Then we pull in the quote, and then we explain and connect to the next source. And then we explain and connect overall. So this is a great example of a synthesis paragraph. And I want you to note too, in the scoring guide for this paper, now keep in mind your scoring guide may look a little bit different depending on which assignment you're working on at this point, which this is assigned for, but synthesis is in your scoring guide. So please look for the sources category, whatever it happens to look like, and you will notice that synthesis, mastery of mature source usage and synthesis is in the A category. Some evidence of synthesis, or the language will read something like this. Attempts synthesis is in the C category. So in other words, I'm going to be looking for some paragraphs that have more than one source. If we've got some good connectors, if we're working on those connectors, or if those connectors are working really well and we have this really smooth mastery type of synthesis going on. I hope this is helpful to you. Please let me know if you have any questions, and we'll definitely be talking about synthesis as we do peer reviews or as we do conferences, whatever is scheduled for your particular class.